There we go. Apologies, everyone, and welcome to this second in the series of SOCI webinars, Supply Chain Security within your Insider Risk program. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Canberra region, the Ngunnawal people. Acknowledge we meet here today on their unceded lands and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people joining us on this webinar here today. Welcome. My name is Matthew Salir. I'm the CEO of the Australian Cyber Collaboration Centre. We're a not-for-profit, member-driven organisation focused on lifting the levels of cyber resilience across the broader Australian economy. And that's especially important around small to medium enterprises who often grapple with the challenge that cybersecurity presents them. So we do that through training, through collaborative projects and webinars like this one, where we collaborate across a range of industries to try and have that real impact on lifting the levels of resilience in the economy. One of those projects that's brought us here today is our Australian Insider Risk Centre of Excellence, where we deliver training, thought leadership activities like this, and a burgeoning community of practitioners discussing the challenges of insider risk within organisations large and small. It's been a really busy week for cybersecurity. We had the Cyber Coordinator announced yesterday and the release of the discussion paper for the new 2023 to 2030 strategy. So there's plenty to talk about, but today's focus is on the supply chain as a component of insider risk. And we've got some wonderful panelists to introduce you to in a moment. That collaboration that we'll see come through their comments today will be evident for all of you. So without further ado, I'll pass to Hamish to introduce himself and give a bit of background.
Well, thanks so much, and it's lovely to be here. My name is Hamish Hansford. I'm the head of the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre here in the Department of Home Affairs. Our key mission really is to protect Australian critical infrastructure and to do that in a really collaborative way. So big announcements this week and really keen to get on with the discussion today about supply chain security.
Thanks, Hamish. And next up, Martin.
Hi, I'm Martin Mosley. I'm a superintendent of the Australian Trusted Trader program. My role was responsible for rolling the program out after the pilot in 2016, and I'm still running the program today. I've spent the last 30 years working in and around this industry, only the last 10 to 12 years in government. Prior to that, generally working in private industry, and have a real fascination around public-private partnerships. My undergrad studies were in Intel and security, and postgrad I have an MBA and postgrad in applied research, and I'm currently completing a PhD on why the changes in policy struggle to lead to changes in practice that focuses on security risk management and the implementation of Commonwealth policy.
Wonderful. And more PhDs to follow, you were saying earlier as well.
Yeah, well, you know, I don't have any life, so research is my entertainment.
You've got to finish this first one.
Wonderful. So, and next, Adash.
My name is Adash Janaszewski. I'm the CEO of Providence Consulting Group, and very delighted to be partnering with Australian Cyber Collaboration Centre in bringing this webinar to all you people. Before I became the CEO of Providence Consulting Group, I came from a background that specialised in the security industry and specialised as a security risk practitioner, and I've worked in various sectors of the industry over the last 20 years, which includes the aviation maritime sector. I spent many years in the defence and national security sector, and have also dabbled and spent a lot of time in industry, state-based infrastructure, and also parts of the critical infrastructure landscape as well.
Perfect. And finally, joining us all the way from Sydney, we have Ben. I'll throw to you, Ben.
Thanks, Matt, and good afternoon all. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Ben Somerville, and I'm the Senior Manager at DHL Express for Customs and Regulatory Affairs. And that essentially, I've got a licensed brokerage background. I'm a broker and trade consultant previously. The role that I'm involved with at the moment is primarily around the border clearance piece, making sure that the supply chain security is in place, the various layers of that, but also at the same time making sure that there is genuine trade facilitation so that there's no congestion at the border. So happy to be involved in the discussion this afternoon. Thanks.
Terrific. Thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone. And you can probably tell we've got this tremendous breadth of experience and expertise here. So we're really excited to see where the conversation takes us this afternoon. And of course, a little bit of housekeeping. We do have the Q&A panel that you'll see on your webinar there. Please, throughout the discussion, enter your questions in there. We'll try to get to as many as we can at various points through to the discussion. But this is a great chance to hear from both government, industry, and others around what are truly pretty important changes that everyone's grappling with. So, and to that point, I think I'll probably throw to Hamish first to set the scene. Obviously, the SOCI Act reforms has broadened the Act to 11 critical sectors and 22 classes of assets. And of course, that ability to have an entity comply with the critical infrastructure risk management plan is now a component piece of that. I just wondered if you give us a bit of a scene set on, what's the importance of that plan and how can owners and operators of critical infrastructure really consider how they might approach that?
Well, great question, and it's been a very big focus of ours for the last 18 months, where we've co-designed a risk management program with a corresponding rule, which effectively gives guidance on what are the key principles that we need to think about in protecting critical infrastructure and in managing risk. I say they're co-designed because that's really what we worked on together in 2021 in the height of the legislative process, to give Parliament and the Australian people confidence around what would then be contained in a final risk management program and its associated rule. That rule then came into force on the 17th of February. It commenced on the 17th of February, and there's a 6-month transition period for people to develop a risk management program against each of the different elements. I guess the key reason why we included supply chain security is because when we spoke together, particularly in the context of Australia's last cyber security strategy, cyber and information security issues and supply chain was an area where everyone was looking into as areas of increasing vulnerability, increasing threats to supply chain in particular. And so we've now developed what we think is a baseline set of obligations for critical infrastructure in Australia that takes into account not only a critical infrastructure asset, but its supply chain as well. It reflects some of the supply chain thinking in other standards like 27001 or in the newly developing Prudential Standard 230 of APRA, really a fundamental view about organisational resilience. If you put a lot of effort into the protection of a critical infrastructure asset or a company and fail to look at supply chain issues, you can find yourself pretty quickly vulnerable to a whole range of different threats, different things that might then have a flow-on impact on the functioning of business and critical infrastructure in the Australian economy. So that's why supply chain's in there. In terms of how to manage it, we've set out a range of principles to say, here are the key elements by which we think mitigation strategies need to take account of. And really they are principles based to give everyone flexibility to tackle supply chain issues in a whole range of different ways. And that might be from a company who has thousands of entities in the supply chain to really use the risk filter to look at how do I mitigate my risks and threats as far as is reasonably practicable. You can't eliminate all risk, but you can certainly take a range of actions to look into the supply chain and have a much deeper look at what fundamentally might have an impact on the functioning of my business. We think that's good business practice. We think it's also good for the economy and good for companies who want to operate in an increasingly contested environment.
And I think you've mentioned risk there, and we'll talk about both that and that 6-month lead, that timeline and what that might look like for a business. But I guess, Adash, I'm really interested to hear your views on how supply chain fits into protective security. You know, that very important crossover, and as Hamish mentioned, there's a range of domains featured, but really honing in on that component. You know, what were your impressions when you saw that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was personally delighted to see appear as part of the SOCI legislation is that supply chain was included into it. As I mentioned in the introduction, I've been involved in this industry for 20 years, working domestically and overseas, and the concept of any government or non-government organisation putting the notion of supply chain security front and centre into their sort of protective security posture, it just wasn't discussed. And I don't know if that accords with your experience, Marty, over the years, but it certainly over the last 2 decades, there's been a focus on very physical protective measures. And this has been in response to the 9/11 and the transition away from the extremists and the terrorism era, where there's been a focus from government industry around very physical protection, and that's transitioned more recently into the cyber domain, where the focus has been firmly on protection of information through the ones and zeros in the cyber dimension. So to see that appear in here is really, really delightful. But what I also note is that it's going to now require, I think, a collective shift between government and industry to understand what that means, look at it through the risk lens, and roll it into how they actually conduct their own supply chain security practices. Now, when I had a look at the explanatory statement issued by the Minister regarding the risk management program rules, the language used in it, I think, is very deliberate and acknowledges the nuance and the intention about what the Act is trying to achieve. It refers to the whole idea of addressing vulnerabilities in relation to suppliers, logistics more problem, and the term there is security of the supply chain. And I think what's important for every organisation to understand is that each of these domains, so suppliers, the logistical supply chain, and security, each deal with a different and unique component of the supply chain context. And fundamentally, what I think is important to understand is supply chain security is very different from supply chain operational assurance, where supply chain assurance focuses on driving operational outcomes within one supply chain, about the movements of goods as efficiently as possible through a particular supply chain, while supply chain security centres on identifying, assessing and managing risk to those supply chains that ultimately emanate from human sources whose exploitation of the supply chain results from either malicious intent or from negligent behaviour. And I think without this fundamental understanding, any security evaluation of someone's supply chain is likely to examine or focus on the wrong things. Marty?
I can tell you've got something to add here.
Look, so it's been a journey. Over the last 7 years, we've dealt with 1,700 companies, or legal entities, not necessarily all companies. But what we've seen is people don't always understand that they're really good at their supply chain. They're pretty good at their supply chain integrity. But the minute you start asking them to talk about supply chain security, there's a bit of a struggle. And I think Hamish's point earlier, we talked about the risk filter or the risk lens, was a good one. People want to focus on the things they're comfortable with. And the insider threat is the thing we're most interested in the program. We rejigged the program back in 2016 to focus on the trusted insider as a key threat vector. But that human dimension is a struggle for people to understand. So we unlike the SOCI legislation, which is going to be legislated, we had it in there. You had to have a security risk focus. You had to build it on a security understanding, and we'd get everything but security, everything but the trusted insider. So there was a lot of work to be done around that, because they were comfortable with an external threat. They were comfortable with a failure of their supply chain. What they weren't comfortable about was considering who within their own organisation would potentially exploit them. And only once they did that could they really understand. So they wanted to spend their money on physical. What was really famous, people go, oh, you won't get businesses on a voluntary program spending money on security. What we actually saw was, it was quite embarrassing. We saw companies wasting money on physical security when all the mitigations we actually wanted to focus on were around that trusted insider, which tended to be personnel security related or governance related. So I'll probably let somebody else talk here, because I can go on for days on this stuff.
But I think that's interesting. I mean, have you got some themes that you saw? So there's a couple there around the challenges that companies face. You know, what were those main ones that they encountered, and how did you see ways through that?
So a lot of it is around education, but obviously we had this real balance. In the early days, we were quite prescriptive, and that was a failure. It was a failure of what the program should have been doing, but a failure of government to understand business. As we developed the program, and I take my hat off to people like Ben and that came in early and helped us readjust what we did, because the nice thing was the take up on the program early was really poor, and that was a blessing in disguise for me, because by the time I got in the program there were only actually 6 members, and we meant we could change everything really quickly, and we did. But taking away from that, and the other thing was, what's government comfortable to look at? The tangible was easy for us to assess, the intangible less so. So understanding the trusted insider, how the trusted insider operates and functions, and that's something the program has kept front and centre right through the last 6 or 7 years.
But I think the challenge that you saw within the Trusted Trader program, which again is a legislative underpin program, is going to emulate many of the challenges going to be faced under SOCI as well, which is people shifting from what has been a traditionally compliance focus to security towards a genuine risk-based approach. Now, the compliance approach to security we have seen, and I'm sure many have connected with, the whole idea of that someone's just looking for a definitive list. If I can somehow just adopt these particular measures, regardless of its suitability to my context or not, somehow that's adequate. Somehow I feel that gives me protection. Somehow that seems to cover the organisation's butt from any sort of regulator or someone intruding. But now, under your program, the Trusted Trader program, again under the SOCI legislation, there's nothing that's mandating any particular security measure. Everything is, as Hamish mentioned, is principles-based, risk-based, and risk-based pretty much says there's no particular measure that you must or must not adopt. It is what is appropriate to your context, your supply chain, your particular risk profile, and what you need is you need to be able to defend and substantiate why you chose a particular structure or strategy and why you didn't, and you have to be able to make that case and be able to defend it. And certainly we have seen, well, I mean, we did a lot of evaluations of entities and supply chains on behalf of your program, Marty, and we saw there was a struggle for people to shift towards that. But we also saw that a lot of benefits could be realised once people understood that there was no one-size-fits-all or prescriptive solution to how to protect their supply chain, including how they had to approach mitigating the insider risk to their supply chain.
And I might just draw Ben in here. And Ben, I'd love to hear how your organisation grappled with that challenge that Adash has just mentioned. Was that, how mature, projecting back to 2016 or even earlier, how did you feel you brought the organisation through that process?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Look, one comment I'd make at the outset is that it definitely is an evolving beast. I think when DHL first became a trusted trader, for instance, back in 2018, last year we had a revalidation of that, and a lot had changed. A lot of people think that these ATT and trusted relationships is just trade compliance, but the supply chain security component is enormous in terms of how we report the data, when we report the data, how we share that in a transparent way. So those areas are constantly evolving. And I suppose the two levels, the comment I make is that there's obviously the mandatory requirements that industry must meet, and that's fine, that needs to be done in accordance with the legislation. But then there's, within the context of those trusted relationships, then there's that flexibility that Hamish alluded to earlier, and that co-design, which we're very encouraged hearing words like that and knowing that it's principles based, because that then allows us to have that more collaborative approach where there is more sharing of intel within trusted channels, of course, but that's where we can see some real gains for industry.
And I think there's some real power there in what Ben's talking about, because there are parts the government understands that industry won't ever understand, won't ever maybe even have access to that data. But there's also stuff that industry can bring to us. And one of the things Ben talks about is some of their understanding of the offshore end of the supply chain, some of the exploitable vulnerabilities offshore, all those things where there's limited influence for us offshore to do that. They actually have some really good understanding and some real power in that. And I think that, and I take my hat off to some of my colleagues in the wider ABF that have really jumped on that and are using those relationships with industry to build what we can do. So I think there's two parts. The minute you start looking at it through a risk lens, I think coming back to our initial point, getting them to start thinking in the context of risk rather than compliance was hard, both for my team, but also I didn't expect to have the difficulty I had trying to get industry to look through a different lens. And some, it was massive. So if I take DHL and there's 20 other companies off the top of my head where they just got it straight away. But for most, it's really been a journey, and size isn't the defining factor. A lot of small, medium-sized enterprises, really strong. Some of the big ones, we've had real trouble.
It's just interesting, actually, as I hear what you responded a few moments ago, Ben, and also what you said a few minutes before that, Marty, about the challenge about understanding the human dimension of the supply chain security risk problem, and also what you observed as well, Ben, because this is one of the immutable observations. Because security fundamentally deals with the human dimension and interface of security vulnerabilities, it's going to never be static. It's always going to adapt and change, and the risk approach and lens accepts that and fundamentally incorporates that into the analytical base. And what you described, Ben, I thought was put really, really well, was that when you went back and formally through your revalidation process, look back and you said, well, so much had changed, and therefore you guys as an organisation had to adjust or trim the sails a little bit, presumably invest a bit more here or back off there, and did that because that acknowledges the changes that you observed within your context. And I think this is the importance of the risk-based approach. It's dynamic and adaptive, while the compliance and the rigid approach is kind of fixed in time, which people at their peril assume that it gives them enduring protection.
Hamish, I wonder whether you're already, it's early days, but I wonder if you're already seeing some of those sectors having further to travel, and what help or assistance might be there. So on the call today, we know we've got a wide range of stakeholders. Are there some areas where there's a longer journey to take, and what might they think about first?
Definitely, and I think of all of the elements of particularly the risk management program, supply chain security is the most difficult, because often it's not within control, or the controls are somewhat limited. So it puts a different risk perspective on it for some. I'm really thinking about those who have a complex supply chain. So if you think about it conceptually, a hospital, for example, has lots of Internet of Things devices. They have utilities which power their hospital. They have a whole lot of inputs in a pretty open work environment with lots of supply chain feeds. So I really think the first step is understand what supply chain elements fundamentally underpin your functioning, and then work backwards, because the big concern I get from some industries who come to us new to particularly supply chain security, or new to security in general, is it's so big, where do I start? And I really think around the issue about materiality. What materially makes you function, not the independent little supplier who actually there's a whole lot of places you can get that from, and there's quite a lot of supply that's built in that you could go different places, but actually thinking much more critically. I think that's the big change first of all, then assessing what do we already do, and that might be good enough or adequate enough for a certain period, or there might be small changes. So I think not getting overwhelmed by the complexity, and actually starting from a conceptual basis of what materially makes us function. Who are our main suppliers? What contracts do we have in place? What do we rely on? And I think the world's changed since, particularly through COVID, from just in time to, well, we've all experienced people ordering things online and they come weeks later. So I think inherently as humans, we're much more skeptical around just-in-time delivery, and we're much more conscious around looking at our supply chain and being much more realistic.
I think Hamish has nailed an important point there. One of the really interesting things when we started talking about supply chain security, and I'm not talking about DHL's involved in some of those, some people understood their supply chain inherently end to end, and some didn't know where to start. But starting is important, right? And if you start mapping out your critical paths, what are the things that would stop you functioning? What are the things that would stop your critical activities? That's a great place to start. Once you start that, and it's one of those, where outcome begets outcome. The minute you start looking at it, you start to, the next thing, I don't know if you've seen this yet, Hamish, is then people go, oh my God, it's so complex, where do I go from here? So then you need to just map those critical paths. Once you start looking at it in those terms, people become really adept at it. And one of the funny things is people go, who do I go to do this? Well, a lot of the time, the best people are in your own house. I'll speak to those within your own teams, and you can map the supply chain. It's different, I know from Hamish's outcome, it's about keeping that supply chain functioning. And for us, a lot of the time, we're looking at the exploitation. But the mapping and the outcome and understanding is critical. And then you change your relationships. And we've seen this with a lot of trusted traders. Suddenly, when they understand the criticality of the supply chain, the relationship with some of those suppliers changes completely. And one of the things we see at revalidation quite regularly is the supply chain has really changed. And we have an annual check-in, if you like, where we speak to them annually, and we'll see that change. As they've started looking at their supply chain, identifying the criticality, identifying where they're vulnerable, not from an exploitation, but from a supply perspective, they will change who they deal with. And that's so being aware is actually the first step. You look at that, you start looking at that risk lens, suddenly you change the way you do it.
And there's great evidence that COVID had a positive effect on supply chain relationships as well. You're seeing some evidence of that, where there's a much more, a better relationship between suppliers than there was before because they've had to have these really difficult conversations.
They've had to engage.
Yeah. So
yesterday you were somebody at the end of a contract and an email. Now you're on the end of a telephone.
So that must have an effect to make the positive change we're talking about here. Yeah.
Look, I know it's not very popular, but there's a lot of positive outcomes from COVID around that, particularly around supply chain.
Probably one of the most positive things that came out of it is it stopped people taking the supply chain for granted. Like that was probably the biggest one. And I realise us when we're in our consumer mode that reflected in you order an object and what arrived next week now was next quarter or in 6 months' time, what have you. And I think that has given people pause for thought and say, right, well, which are the supply chains I need to nurture to keep my aspect of the business going? Not every aspect of it, but the critical parts of it. Now, one of the things that I observed when we're evaluating some of the entity supply chain security risk is that organisations may not be able to document or clinically articulate that, but they had some odd intuitive understanding about what mattered more versus what mattered less. And often it was a good starting point that if you could listen to that intuition that these things matter more in the context of my business and the critical parts of it than these, it was a good place to start to pare back the focus of what you did. And the other part that I found interesting, and particularly in the international supply chain, it was easy for people to get fixated upon the supply chain only being about the movement of goods from point to point. And there's so much more than that. It is connected with the systems and the information that is required to be exchanged between areas to be able to move items across the border. So we often guide people saying, don't think about your supply chains solely in terms of how items move. Think about the entire connected ecosphere of it.
So I'm conscious we've got a couple of questions coming in, so we might take a pause and go to the audience. So we've got one there. How can you measure maturity of your supply chain? Dash, maybe you want to have a
yeah, well, I mean, look, probably the easiest, I mean, look, there are a number of standards out there that exist in the ISO range, in the 28,000 range, that will give you an idea about what represents better practice. None of those standards out there are explicit about what you should or should not do, but it talks about the foundation and the building blocks of a better or a more mature approach to supply chain. But certainly probably the best and most functional way is if you can establish, much like leveraging off what Hamish said before, if you can establish which parts of your supply chain are critical, it's a good starting point. If you can work out how to describe and reflect your current supply chain and go through the process about reflecting where those vulnerabilities are and how they can be exploited by human-based actors, you've established a risk profile and therefore a maturity profile. If you establish that at a baseline and check in with that at some regular period and oversee it through structured governance systems, you'll be able to turn around and say, in the last 3 months, are we better now than where we were in the 3 months prior? Are we better in 6 months than we were? So the best way to measure your maturity is to work out where you are now and measure your relative change to that point.
And proactively, presumably, not because there's a regulatory reporting requirement or what have you. It should be part of the business practice.
It should. I mean, it makes good business. I mean, in my view is that the strength of SOCI is that businesses both commercially prosper and the nation also prospers from having resilient supply chains or resilient critical infrastructure.
Another one maybe for you, Ben. If trusted trader clients are not treating insider risk, how can you see them improving their security posture?
Trusted.
Bet on Marty. I think
look, Marty, just a quick comment. I would suggest that trusted traders should be focusing on that area heavily because it is an area of risk. And to Adash's point about being doing that proactive analysis is not just reporting cargo in the ICS about what's coming in and out of the country, but also doing some analysis around the risk of that, whether it's a particular consignment, a supplier, a destination, an individual. If that is of risk, then volunteering that. So we're on a hotline to Border Watch, the ABF program for volunteering suspicious activity, and those types of programs we as an industry stakeholder are all for, because it's an obligation of being a trusted trader is to be able to provide that transparency so that risk can be evaluated. We might not think it passes the sniff test, so we'll volunteer it every time.
I think that's one part of it. If I can just go to that question about I'd suggest if they're not treating the trusted insider risk, they're probably not treating the risk at all.
Yes.
Because, I think if I go to Ben quickly there, one of the points that I'd say about makes me really comfortable with DHL, and we're talking about DHL Express here because DHL's multiple legal entities, but and this isn't a criticism of any of them, but specifically Ben's organisation, is they acknowledge it's one of their biggest risks. Because they acknowledge it's one of their risks and they're assessing that risk, they also have a mitigation strategy for it. Because if somebody goes to me, it's like if somebody says, somebody says, I've never had a cyber issue, they've got no knowledge or no understanding, because we all suffer it, right? If they're not having issues and they haven't had to mitigate or deal with something, what are going on with all the phishing emails and everything, they've got no awareness. It's the same. If somebody says, we don't need to treat the trusted insider risk, we've got no problem. There's an alarm bell going on. Also probably means I've failed in my work for the last 6 years. Sorry, you were going to say
I was just going to make a point about maturity and actually looking at your own supply chain won't tell you all of the supply chain risks at all. So what's the challenge for government and industry in the future? It's not until you do exercises, for example, with 5 different players from within an industry, you realise everyone relies on the same thing, potentially. And so I actually think there's a strong role for us to focus on supply chain security today, including implementing SOCI, which would be fantastic for everyone to get onto between now and 17 August. But actually the broader challenge is, how do we work together on what are the national vulnerabilities in our supply chain? Where does interdependency lie? How do we start to build up a community with industry and government that actually starts to tackle some of those issues? The banking and finance sector is starting to do it at the moment, particularly looking at, well, what do we rely on, particularly in terms of storage of data and other elements. So I really think that's a challenge I'd like to put out for this panel, but also everyone on this call, is how do we work together to try and look at systemic supply chain vulnerabilities and risk that we can start to treat as a group of critical infrastructure stakeholders in Australia.
So I could ask you, Hamish, do you see that someone will step forward and in effect be the intermediary or conduct the analysis of trends across sectors and asset classes that says, hey, we've noticed that entity A and B and C all rely on the same thing, and therefore one small disruption disproportionately affects 3 different. Do you see that government will play a central role in filling that cross-levelling function?
Definitely, and we even have our trusted information sharing network working groups. Many of the working groups are working on this very issue now. I think there's time to step up our engagement with TISN and as a collaborative mechanism to tackle some of these issues. And I really think that that is the strong role that government should play now that we've got the final set of risk management program rules in place. We need to now operationalise it and work with you as partners.
And I think if you go back to a previous iteration of TISN in the mid-2000s, they did some sort of aspirational work in that area, and I think there's some really good chance. It's not like you can go back and find the answer, but there was work done. I think Dr. Seville, an academic out of New Zealand, did really good work on that supply chain and interdependency. And the minute you start pulling the threads, you realise government, regulator or not, can't do it alone. Industry can't do it alone. It becomes a collaborative process. And those community of interest and that reinvigoration of the TISN to deliver that will become really powerful if industry engages. You're already doing your bit, but bringing them along for the ride. And, in a microcosm, what Ben's talking about, we do, but we only do it for a very small part. What Trusted Trader looks at versus what SOCI has to look at is a massively different spectrum of work.
And I guess I'm keen, Ben, to pull you back in again around that integration. We're talking at this macro level of SOCI, but that integration at an organisational level, and how you integrated or DHL managed to integrate that supply chain security into that broader system of security that just is inherent in the organisation. What are some of the lessons you learned along the way that you can share?
Well, I think, ABF and biosecurity officers are embedded into all of our facilities. So there's that regulatory element there with those mandatory controls that I talked about earlier. But we try and definitely take the approach of trying to look at ways where we can mitigate a risk. One very quick example of that is we worked with a university, their data science institute, to develop a a predictive model to look at export risk, so dual use strategic goods, that sort of thing, to look at identifying those earlier before they even hit our facilities to be exported to all around the world. So, and that is now being developed to the point that we can pass that on to the regulator for the benefit of all industry. So we're looking at things, and to Hamish's point about how it is, I'm in furious agreement that if industry just looks at their own supply chain, then it will be, or it does run the risk of being a bit of a navel-gazing exercise. We need that intel. And even another quick example would be if a commodity is coming in and it's a particular pathway has been detected, then odds on that will be pushed to the air or the sea or wherever it's coming into. So us knowing that in advance is extremely useful, and we only get that through that ongoing collaboration, if that makes sense.
And I guess it's all about people within an organisation. So can you highlight any of those unexpected benefits of bringing different components of the organisation together to think about these things that perhaps mightn't have done that before?
Yeah, look, I think security is it's one of those things. It's not just the security manager or his or her team that look at that. It's the whole organisation. So the mantra is, like it is no doubt with many other industry stakeholders, is that it's everyone's responsibility. That's a key fundamental. Then in looking at that, we look at all sectors of, so our recruitment policy, what is that about? Is it's obviously got certain elements, but is that enough? And can we flesh that out to make that more robust? And it's not a matter of just getting people on board and then forgetting about it. It's ongoing training, it's ongoing monitoring, that sort of thing. So there's it never sleeps really in terms of just being able to manage that risk.
And obviously compliance, governance, risk all land together and permeate up to the board. Did you see some reactions that you expected or didn't expect? So again, along the lines of helping everyone who's listening today think about the things that they need to put on their list of to-dos as they go through this. Have you had some unexpected positives from getting the board engaged in the processes of perhaps investment you've had to make to get where you are?
I think, Matt, it's galvanised from speaking from personal experience, it's galvanised the senior management and the board's resolve to really look at these things in focus. It's already front and centre. This is, if anything, it's really just crystallised the importance of that. An example of that would be that the policies that we have in place to make sure that it's not just a background check, but it's a more robust suite of policies, like a code of conduct and a anti-competition and cyber security, and that's those types of things are fundamental for all staff, not just at senior management or as not just the security team. It's all staff can and do go through those processes, and I think if anything, these changes have really galvanised that for us as an organisation.
It's an interesting question, Matt, because that's what we're trying to do with the risk management program, is combine all of the different, we call them hazards or material risks, into one area. And then the worst thing you can do is report to the government and show us your risk management program. But actually getting boards to sign off on it, or the governing authority, I think forces exactly what Ben's trying to make the point on. It forces boards and CEOs to think about things holistically. And I think that the permeating effect throughout an organisation, we hope, is that everyone will start to have to work with others to integrate things together in one program and to start to think about risk in a different way. Because I think if we've learned anything over the last couple of years, it's that everything is now interrelated and you can't just treat one risk independent of others. You've got to think about it at an enterprise level. So hopefully this is a forcing factor. The then flow-on issue that we need to work on, I think, is how do we motivate boards? How do we get them to ask the right questions? How do we empower them to have greater confidence in organisations? And how do we get security managers, CISOs, COOs talking to boards in the language that they understand, and actually starting to marry up the risk identification with the risk mitigation and the cost with options about how that might be achieved. Because I kind of get the sense from talking to some board members that a lot of managers, and I'm guilty of it as well, putting up a great idea with a large price tag, but actually saying, here's what you get for this, here's what you get for added fiscal investment, and here's how it relates to other parts of the organisation. Even better if you come together with a consolidated package. So I think that's the maturity journey that we're all on, regardless of whether or not you're working in government or the private sector.
And I think that board education piece, yeah, certainly underpins a lot of the things we talk about in cybersecurity as well. But Marty, I wonder if have you seen really other great examples of that, or everything has lights and shadows? Eddie, really challenging.
We've seen it on a spectrum. One of the really interesting things, at the smaller scale of business, where somebody has control, is quite easy to galvanise, get them to understand security. Once you get them to understand the trusted insider, they have a real light bulb moment. Right? The whole focus of what they do will change. We've seen that. With larger enterprises, once you start going to a board, it can actually be problematic sometimes to get that in front of them. I think one of the nice things, we talk about trusted trader. We dealt with 1,600, 1,700 businesses, 1,650, something like that. What you actually know is there's only 900 accredited trusted traders. We've refused close to 40, 50, but a lot of those haven't got in. They've literally just not made them up. We explained to them what they needed to do. They've just moved away, or someone just said it's not for us. We've also cancelled around 40 accreditations. But one of the things we found is quite interesting is this sudden change, because they assume it's a walk-up start. When they get their notice, procedural fairness, we don't just refuse you, you get an intention to refuse, and these are the reasons. Suddenly senior management go, oh. And then we get, so a lesson we learned a few years ago was, you can't nominate to join the program if you're just a manager. We want somebody to report to a board level or a director to sponsor the program and bring you in. And then it's that person that's notified that you actually don't have sufficient security measures in place. You're not addressing the trust, whatever the reason might be. We highlight that for them, and that generates a discussion. So it's not like a blunt stick, but people don't get in. And I think that changes the view. But we don't want them in. If they're not interested and they're not engaged in their supply chain security, we don't want them in the program. So our experience is, and I've had some really good conversations with senior leadership around this stuff and about making them understand. But at the end of the day, 9 times out of 10, security is on the back burner, right? The relevant senior security person is generally not in the executive suite. They're often not reporting to the board, and that's one of the issues. So if SOCI or other legislation or rules or administration can move that, you totally change it. Let me tell you, I'm sure after Medibank and a couple of the other recent incidents, the cybersecurity guys getting a lot of time in front of the executive. They're getting their chance to explain, because people understand there's a cost. And the minute there's a cost that impacts on businesses, people change their focus.
Without that buy-in at the board or executive level in any organisation, I don't think organisations get the resilience uplift that they actually need.
Correct.
There's a big and heavy dimension of managing the insider risk and the insider risk to the supply chain. The two are interrelated, and we can jump in a bit of detail further in conversation how it sort of plays out in a technical detail. But we know full well one of the best mitigations against insider risk is education, culture, oversight, management, leadership, example setting from the top. And everyone's heard that statement has come out publicly, is that culture and attitude starts at the top. And a board or an executive that takes this problem seriously and is invested in it being addressed will permeate that through the organisation, and in some big ways that gives you an immutable foundation upon which more technical security measures and strategies can actually succeed. So I don't think any of this is really going to yield the outcomes that you're after without that buy-in at the top level.
Well, you've brought us back nicely, segue to our next question, which is really pulling back to the people. So I'm really interested. Obviously, all threats started out as a risk, but not all risks cross that threshold to become that insider threat. Can you give us a bit of a sense, Adash, about how important this supply chain security dimension is to this insider risk piece? Just to draw on that.
The bottom line is it's essential. So both myself and our company have evaluated somewhere in the order of 50 entities in their supply chains as part of the Trusted Trader program. And I can, in nearly every single circumstance, the ability for the organisation to recognise and manage insider risk was completely material. It was material to the overall supply chain security risk. Now, there were occasions where there were simple supply chains and simple organisation structures where it mattered a little bit less, but that was very much the exception rather than the rule. So rarely did I ever observe that a structural system had been developed in a way that put insider risk front and centre within the broader security management structure. Now, what I find interesting here and what I think has been well designed about the SOCI legislation is that the different components of it overlap neatly, right? So if we discussed, I think back last year, we were talking about some of the personnel hazards component of the SOCI legislation. And it even says in there that under Section 9 that for personal hazards, there are requirements for the risk management program to adopt mechanisms for identifying critical workers, conducting risk-based employment screening, conducting ongoing suitability assessments, and having some structure to their offboarding program. Now, interestingly, all those elements form part of an effective workforce assurance and insider risk management program. So the two sort of overlap. So in some ways, this isn't about trying to treat supply chain, which is kind of the focus of today's things, in isolation of any other part of the components of the SOCI legislation. They all interrelate.
And I think, I think one of the things is that we all think of security as, and I think this goes back to our childhood. We think locks, doors, parents have your locks up, but security a lot of the times is actually quite a soft skill. It's around that governance, around how you, but good personnel security. And if you take, there's classified ones, but there's also unclassed national security trusted insider case studies. And if you look at them, a lot of them talk about, and a lot of this will be about mitigating litigation and those things, but if you look at them, people say, oh, if I'd been stopped earlier, if something had happened, I might have changed my behaviour. There's a lot of what ifs there. And if we had Dr. Doug Allen, who does a lot of work around the trusted insider, he'd have an argument here with me about this. But there's some really good research published on this stuff. A good HR management system, personnel security system, they're integrated together and deliver the outcome around the trusted insider. So what happens is we want to talk security, we want to talk the tough stuff, we want to talk about what we do. But a lot of it's about how you have that human resource management. One of the things we work with trusted traders is, how do you do? What's your care program for it? What do you do when somebody's going through a life crisis? Because if you chart a lot of trusted insiders, it starts with a life crisis. So how you manage that becomes really important. And you've got to stratify it, right? And I think Adash's work with us tended to go on as we were nascent, we were developing our skill set, and I needed people to mentor in the field. We now use it as an assessment process and those. But in the really early days when Adash was actually out doing some of the work with us, you remember that agribusiness where this, and they came back and we'd had this, we do our own assessment internally, right? We know it's full of criminals, there's people with immigration, so we're looking at this model and we're going, they're going to be really interesting to assess. But I remember you actually went out on site and got the explanation. It was really interesting.
I mean, this is interesting, and it goes into what I mentioned before around the personal hazards component about conducting risk-based pre-employment screening. Because this organisation that we went and co-evaluated, on paper, you would wonder how they would ever be able to make the case they had a secure supply chain. They had a heavily transient, high turnover, blue-collar workforce, many of which had come with a criminal background, and they also had a white-collar workforce as well. Now, what was fascinating and really impressive about the organisation, they knew their organisation well enough to recognise the concerns are not with the blue-collar workforce and people who have criminal backgrounds. Actually, the white-collar part of the workforce that interface, that interacted with the systems, where the stroke of a key would cause more harm to their supply chain integrity than what anyone would do in the bottom. So, interesting, coming from a heavy government security background where there has been a prevailing view that somehow if you've done wrong criminally in the past, you therefore can't be trusted. That view does not hold up to the risk-based approach that says maybe you can be trusted, maybe you can't. If you've conducted repeated fraud and then you're getting access into sensitive systems that the information of which relies on how security chains operate, maybe that represents a risk. But if you've done some bad things criminally in the past and operated in a non-critical part of the supply chain, maybe that's okay. The only way that you can actually manage that is by having a good risk-based workforce screening, and then you've got ongoing suitability assessment. And to go to Marty's point before, the reason why part of what we did from a security assessment perspective, we weren't always talking to the security officer. We're often talking to the HR person. Tell us about how you manage your people. How do you get to know them? How do you make judgment about when life circumstances change for an individual and whether that requires that individual to be managed differently, redirected to another part of the organisation. And that was just active management. And this organisation did that really, really well and sailed through the evaluation process. They got it at every level.
It was clearly risk-based, right? They said this part of our workforce, and what was really funny was they said, oh, we were surprised. They were actually surprised with it. And one of the interesting things is we found actually it's quite common in agribusiness because a lot of people don't want to work in it, right? So it was a lesson for us. But I remember having arguments with some of my colleagues in the organisation. Well, we know they've got problems with this, but when we went there and they talked about it, but what was really interesting was they understood they were vulnerable from their white collar workforce. The controls around their white collar workforce, dual authentication, making sure that no one could authorise any movement of something by themselves. Orders were placed through 3 people because they go, oh, we're a high fraud industry. The exploitation of our supply, and like you're sitting there going, you're actually speaking my language. What came back was a completely different model to what you looked at that first assessment, but it was an understanding of the risk that allowed them to build that stratified model that mitigated their potential exploitations. It was a really interesting lesson to us that what you look at from the outside isn't what you always see when you go in there. And we've had the reverse as well.
That seems to speak to the principles-based approach. Hamish, like spot on, right? So that this one size doesn't fit all, that preconceived notion you might have, we need to have a different approach in this space.
Definitely. And I really think that the best outcome is where you engage people and you have those conversations. So it sounds like in this scenario, there was an active conversation with the workforce to design something that was bespoke for them based on risk. And that's the best outcome we see. The worst outcome we see is where things are imposed either on the supply chain or on staff, and there's no co-design, there's no cultural change, there's not a security of culture. There's not a security culture within the discussions, and I think that's the worst outcome that we can face.
And it's lazy, right? It's just a one size fits all. And then what you get is everyone's disgruntled, and now you've just increased the likelihood of a trusted insider incident.
But even more that when one size fits all, it means there are a set of measures that are fixed in place, and it actually makes it easier for an insider to observe and therefore adapt their behaviour and exploit it easier. When the security posture or systems adapt to the environment incrementally, it creates uncertainty in the mind of the adversary. While it's fixed, it's predictive. While it's predictive, it's exploitable.
So Marty, there's a question there about non-ICT risk. We've sort of talked about the HR elements. What are some others that you've seen going through that process?
So I'll go to the ICT one because it's one that, but really super quick.
Yeah.
ICT treatment's interesting because they're all risk-based, and there's another academic that Adash and I spent some time around, and we had this debate in front of him, and he came up with some really good stuff. And it was around that some risk events are so pervasive that it almost becomes a compliance. So we use the essential A, we use the maturity modelling to understand, and it's different for business to business, small business versus large business, business dependent ICT. So yes, you can say everyone talks about ICT, but you've got to understand it. You've got to understand your context. The non-related, generally it's the trusted insider. We see very little exploitation of supply chain for theft. We see very little. The other would be, but again, it's trusted insiders generally, is around the fraud, right? We've seen, and one of the sad good things about Trusted Trader, as we've gone through the process and worked with some businesses, they have identified fraud within their supply chain because they start looking at what people are doing, looking at authorisations, changing models. So around that, so the consistent risk is around that exploitation, but then also understanding who are the partners you can trust. And a partner you trust isn't necessarily about a contract. It's about a relationship. It's about the things you value. One of the things that the saddest things we hear is when people say, how do you develop your relationships with your partners? And they go, oh, price and speed. Literally, like we're looking for 2 things, how cheap we can get it and how quick we can get it. That's the disaster waiting to happen. Right? But understanding when people start talking about length of service, engagement, how long do they keep clients? Price will always be a factor, right? It always play a part because it affects your bottom line. But understanding that longevity and that engagement. So one of them is how do they relate with their external partners? And one of the keys, so the rule gives me sort of 8 underpinning things we must look at when we're assessing an entity. And one of those is around relationships with other parties, not necessarily third parties, others you do business with and rely on. And I think that's critical. So if I wasn't talking about the trusted insider, which most people are sick about hearing me bang on about, the next thing would be about how do you build your relationships with others, and that's not necessarily always about security. It's about the trust and the integrity of the relationship.
So it's really interesting. There is now an emerging attention that's happening within the Australian context. It's already started over in Europe about 6-7 years ago, which is built on the ISO 44001 standard, which is the collaborative business relationship management system standard. We're now starting to see that federal and state government and some industry bodies are demanding organisations to adhere to the principles of the collaborative business relationship management system. Why? Because it is built on how you create relationships where you have shared investment in each other's success. And while on the face of it, people might nod and say, yeah, this makes intuitive sense. The statement you made before, where you talk about speed and cost, doesn't take reliability of relationship into that equation. There's now a standard in there that is being that has already emerged within Western Europe and is starting to come into the Australian context, which says you can build systems that recognise the value of deep-seated relationships where you're invested in each other's success, and that actually builds resilience to your organisation and your supply chains by having mechanisms like that in place.
Ben, is this sort of thematic ringing true with your experience? That speed and price seems a fairly rudimentary way to what are the dimensions that you felt have provided the greatest benefit?
Yeah, I think that flow of information back from government is really key as well. So an example of that, without going into the specifics of it, but it's where we were putting certain checks in place, but we weren't getting information back from that particular entity that was assessing those as to whether or not it was potentially a risk. That was delayed or sometimes not at all. So that is so critical to industry. If we're doing these background checks, which in and of itself could be improved, I think that would be something that there's probably upward of 5 to 6 separate individual background checks that have to be given to agencies, and Simplified Trade System Task Force is looking at areas like that to streamline those. But yeah, just making sure that if industry has that meets that requirement of giving that information, that there's that flow back to, hold on a sec, you might want to look at this particular individual or group of individuals in a more timely fashion so that we can be more nimble and act appropriately. That is a key part of it.
And I know you mentioned as we were preparing for today about that agility, that need to adjust and adapt when those things occur, when the information is slower than you expected or not at all. What are some of the ways that people could fold that into their approach to sort of not feel like they're constantly changing, but they've got a framework that enables them to adjust as required?
Yeah, well, again, without sounding like a broken record, having the trusted relationship is key, because I mean, a certain thing called COVID really hit everyone on this call very hard. And one of the areas where we were able to adapt is we literally were able to move we had a customs licensed depot, which was housing customs controlled goods. We were able to move those to another facility literally overnight, based on, we had to meet certain security criteria, but it was, again, a risk-based move, and it allowed cargo to keep moving pretty much for when PAX aircraft were grounded. So those types of things, you don't anticipate 120 staff in one facility having to quarantine themselves because they're deemed close contacts. You don't think about those things until they hit you. So it's about trying to predict as best you can those types of elements, and then if the proverbial hits the fan, working with those regulators to say, look, this is what we need to do to manage that. This is the risk. Assess it, move forward.
But some of that was easier for them because the work they'd already done. They'd already done a risk assessment. They understood what the risk was and the specific context of that in the existing facility. They could transfer that to the other footprint and go here. And we worked with them on this, with customs license and others, and say, look, the risk profile isn't substantially changed. As the regulator, we can be comfortable they're doing the right thing. But they had the plan, they had the additional mitigations in place. But that was because they'd already known and examined their business and looked at where it was. So it actually allowed them to be, their agility allowed us to be agile as government, which I know government and agile in the same sentence isn't always that common. But in that one, that's a really good example about, because they've done the work and we've done the work, when that unforeseen event occurred, we were actually allowed to, yeah, and it literally was something I don't think anyone had done before. And it was a really nice outcome. It was quite positive. And there's a whole range of examples with both DHL and a number of other trusted traders during COVID, where that agility and that understanding of their risk exposure allowed government to be agile in partnership with them. And I think, you know, it's probably something we need to celebrate a bit more and do some more work on. I don't just mean with trusted trader, I saw in other areas of government as well. It was really interesting how quickly some things moved.
And I suppose, Hamish, that it's about how do you embed that as a practice throughout this. You know, that COVID was an extreme event for all of our lifetimes, but how do you take those lessons learned, the positive and unfortunate negatives, but how do you apply them in there? So has there been some thought given to that?
Definitely, and I think we all became toilet paper hoarders during COVID, secretly have that little stash just in the event that happens again. But I think that the best examples of how you mitigate risk is people who practice it, people who have the mindset, people who just generally engage with risk on a day-to-day basis. And the question really went to supply chain issues outside of ICT. And I think it's a really interesting question, because you often think of supply chain and think directly about software, about IT systems, about data inflows. But I think during COVID, we learned that the supply chain is a little bit more fragile than we ever expected, and we started to think a bit more broadly and get back to what really fundamentally underpins our life at home and our life at work, and then in a company perspective, what do we actually rely on? And as the supply chain started to get much more stretched, things like a shortage of AdBlue really underpins the functioning of society and the transport of goods. Things like chemicals to purify water fundamentally underpins the water sector. Technicians in short supply who are in a different country that fly into Australia on a fly-in, fly-out basis are particularly critical to the longer-term T2 maintenance of infrastructure, particularly critical faults that happen. So you start to build up a much more granular understanding of what does the supply chain mean. And I think we need to learn the lessons of COVID and apply them on a day-to-day basis. Flexibility, agility and adaptivity are really key among those. And I think even in government, I think we've learned to do that. And to be able to break through different regulations when it's required to adjust to different problems. I kind of think when David Thodey reviewed the APS, the Australian Public Service, that's one of the challenges he set out for us is how do we work across agencies on whole of government outcomes in a much more agile manner.
I know that's sort of touching on something that we talked about outside, Marty, which is the skills and capabilities you need that are probably beyond one. Well, they're very much beyond one discipline, but how do you get that integration, and how are we filling that pipeline? So we think about sovereign capability of specialist repair technicians, all the way through to staffing these new functions that are so cross-disciplinary. So what have you seen as good examples of that? Are you seeing some light in the tunnel, or we've still got a big lump there?
I think there's two things, and I'm going to give you sort of a macro and a micro example maybe. I think one of the things you talked about is skill sets are now global. No longer do we have a skill set and go, that skill set will always be in Australia, or that skill set is always there. So that's the first one, and we saw that the examples of technicians not being able to get in, suddenly we realised actually force them to quarantine and then they're not going to come. We actually need to find a way to get these people in to do work. And it's not just that, there was also that internal borders, you know, fly-in, fly-out workers in WA and stuff like that. It became really important, but also where do skills reside? And I think we're an importer of skills. I didn't go to the university late in life until my mid-20s and haven't left since my mid-20s. So I've been there 10 years now, over 30 years, or going on 30 years now. But one of the things I see is the number of international students, but also international expertise in our educational sphere. They don't function without it. The university had to really jump, but one of the things was it left them without a load of skill sets. And you had to change how they brought that in. That's your macro example. We've got to be able to move people around, or we need to build them organically. Our own experience on the program was, I inherited this program, given it, you go, okay, now we need a skill set, and you go, okay, well, that skill set doesn't reside in the ABF. Okay, that's fine, because, you know, we can do that. Well, I needed people that could do supply chain security, people that could do risk analysis, people that could approach protective security, but from a commercial perspective, not from a government perspective. So not the PSP, Protective Security Policy Framework, not that, but a cost-benefit analysis of security. So we went and we went, okay, we can't find it in government. Turns out we couldn't find it outside government either. Then it became really problematic. We looked globally and nationally for people that could train their teams, and it didn't exist. So what you sometimes have to do is build that organic capability, and I think sometimes in Australia we may need to look for some of that more organically. I know for Trusted Trader, we partnered with a number of agencies early on, did some pilot projects, and we struggled. We worked with academia, we worked with others, and Providence were already providing support in other areas, and we ended up partnering with them, and we built a bespoke program that we're now bringing people in from other areas of government. We haven't quite funded it enough to bring people in from India, but I think there would be value in that at some point. But sometimes you just got to go out and build the skill set, and acknowledging that it doesn't exist is the first step. And I've seen that around. If you look around resilience a few years ago, people wanted to start working on resilience and want to start building it, and you couldn't actually find anyone as a practitioner that was doing it. So and now I look around, it's amazing because you can meet people that really worked at it.
I mean, it's interesting the journey that we've been on to do that, because when I first got connected with you guys, you were the security risk practitioner for your area, but
I wasn't supposed to be. I was supposed to be the generalist.
As a delegate for the Comptroller General, it wasn't your job to go out on the ground and do those assessments. But I mean, we look, it took a number of iterations to build that program, but I mean, we would have shoved more than 100 people through it over the years.
And we've now 4 or 5 different government departments. We're now at the point where we're going, we can't actually put your people on this at the moment. We need to actually train my people because that's what it's there for.
But one of the things, in fact, I'll pay you some compliments here in terms of how you designed and requested the design of that skilling program to suit your needs. It recognised to develop the capacity to think about risk within this context was never going to be learned and garnered on a 2-day or a 5-day course. I mean, your current program now sits over a 12 to 14-month period that has both educational components, mentor components, on-site supervision and management. And through that, you've actually injected knowledge about thinking about supply chain security through a risk lens now over the last, 6 years you've been in the job? I mean, so you've created a body of experts now in that area. I mean, we've been delighted to be able to help you with that. But you recognise that gaining that mindset was never going to be done quickly. And I think the takeaway for any industry doing it is that shifting people's mindsets and focus and understanding on the fundamentals isn't done by doing an online course. It takes investment, it takes patience, it takes giving people the time to learn. It takes oversight, support and management. And if you're not willing to do that or take a longer term view to generate that capability, I believe that you'll do that at your own peril. So it's worked well for your program. I think it's worked well for many industry partners that have benefited from the advice that they've got from your staff.
So to give that context in a commercial sense, if I was running a business,
which you have, by the way.
I've run a few businesses, but our net approval rating in 2018 for the program was -40. Any of you that have done marketing are going to know. Basically, if I was in business, if I was the COO, they were sacking me. I was. We turn it around now to a plus 36, 37, and it's constantly increasing. And I would suggest to you the majority of that is I now have people out there where they go, you're now at it. And what the best feedback I've had in the last few years was some written independent feedback on the program where they said, we had just paid for an ISO 9001 audit that cost us $40,000, some benefit. The visit from the ATT team, outstanding. We have re-understood our business. It's changed what we've done. And that, for me, was one of the most satisfying pieces. But that's come from the team and from the training, from the support and the engagement. But you've got to look at what you do. And it's understanding that sometimes problems are unique. And this is, if you look in critical infrastructure, I did some time in critical infrastructure around a specific sector in New South Wales. And one of the biggest issues we faced was the engineers. We had no engineers in Australia that could. Well, we had an engineering group of about 12 people that were predominantly in their late 50s, early 60s that were going to be retiring in the next 10 years, and there was no skill set in Australia to replace them. That organisation had to make the decision to start raising up young engineers in Australia. And if they hadn't have done that, I haven't worked with them for well over a decade, but I know when COVID hit, they would have been stuffed if they were still relying on external, that kind of experience and knowledge you can't be dependent on a source that may be interrupted. Sometimes you need to, and understand your supply chain around people as well is important.
And bringing you back in, Ben, did you have a similar experience? So did you see capability come from parts of the business that you hadn't expected? And I guess that's a leading question for some of our audience to sort of think about where they might look for that capability, knowing there's a bit of a lag on talent coming in.
Yeah, certainly. Again, it's not just the security or even just the HR areas, it's all staff. And one point I definitely agree with that, empowering staff to be able to do. So it's not, as Adash said, it's not just about sitting through some mandatory training and ticking a few boxes. It's actually about empowering staff to be able to, if they see something that is not quite right, to flag that. And we regularly get Border Watch into both our brokers, our office-based staff and staff on the floor to brief them on what are some of the trends, what are the methods of concealment, what are the pathways. There's the more that we can upskill staff so that they can actually see what those risks are, the more likely they can then speak into those and relate to those regulatory threats. So that's a really key part, is having the training, yes, but also empowering staff to be able to use that, whether it's with state or federal police or ABF or CISC or whoever it is. We should be and are engaging with them and empowering staff to be able to flag. I think in the last 2 years, there's been close to 1,000 referrals that DHL alone has made. So that we take it seriously in terms of walking the walk and not just saying we'll play ball. I think it's incumbent on industry to really give that information, and I suppose in the same breath that government can provide the necessary guidance where it can as well. Yeah.
I think on that, there's passed away now. There was a researcher in Canberra called Larry Cromwell, and his work's around what they refer to as predictive profiling. But there's other work, Seville and others, where they talk about empowerment of staff. And one of the things, if your business is going to be resilient and delivers competent security outcomes, you need to engage with your working level staff. Just like, I'm a bit of a lean nerd. Spent time around me knows that. But if you look at lean talks about going to Gemba, going to the place of truth and talking to the people that actually do the work. And a lot of the time, understanding how you will be exploited or understanding the threat or the risks you face, you actually need to be talking to people at the coalface. So if you're in critical infrastructure around power supply, those things, a lot of people will know. Now, you've got to be careful that they don't transfer their expert knowledge to an assailant that doesn't have that expert knowledge. But if you look at Dr. Doug Allen's work, one of the things he would tell you is the trusting side will spend a lot of time researching your business before they exploit them. So you've got to have that tension, you've got to have that empowerment of your staff to be engaged in the process, and you've got to listen to them.
And Hamish, I guess this is, in my mind, this is all about culture change as well. And I wonder how you're thinking about that within the broader team you have, the outreach officers we spoke about before. How are they? How are you, and how is the team being helped to sort of take those steps forward as the industry takes their steps forward as well? Is that something you focus on?
Definitely, and I think as you mentioned, Marty, that actually having people on the ground, engaging with the industry, doing town halls, doing webinars like this, we get a whole bunch of feedback which go right to the heart of some of the issues, everything from legislative design to advice on uplift to engaging with people around making connections. So I think unless you're engaging in a really deliberative manner, as a regulator, but also as a centre that looks at national coordination and national protection, unless we're working with industry day in, day out, we're not going to get the right outcomes for Australia. So I think an outreach team that I'd like to have triple the size, but they're on the ground talking to industry and actually engaging in those conversations. And often, I think, Marty, you said before, as public servants, how do you be more agile? Actually being out and facing industry and facing the public is, for a bureaucrat, quite a difficult experience in some way, because we're often internally focused. But if we take the lead from the Prime Minister and his approach, how do we start to build, design and implement a whole change in society from our perspective in critical infrastructure, but more generally across service delivery in the Commonwealth and in states and territories? I think that's really an aspirational goal that we should work on every day.
It's really good.
And I think you're seeing lots of agencies have that similar approach. ASIO put out a report last week that, I think there's some growing signs that sort of transparency and openness is translating through a culture. And I think that's what this is all
well, interesting. One of the things that I like the underpinnings of SOCI and also with the Trusted Trader program, none of this is designed for a combative relationship between the regulator and industry. None of this is about trying to catch someone out or be punitive. This is about creating trust relationship on both sides of the equation to the benefit of both. I mean, it's interesting what you said before, Ben, that you've made somewhere in the order of 1,000 referrals over into Border Watch or equivalent. DHL, it seems, has not been summarily punished as a result of doing that. I'd imagine that you've probably built deeper trust with the regulator by doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. And we look at some of the risk too. We can develop that and identify and attack the risk pre-border as well before those threats arrive on our shore. So there's a lot of different facets to it.
Has that sort of internal dynamic had other unexpected sort of benefits that you can point to already, Ben?
I think that it's probably, Matt, it's helped our staff again around just understanding that it's not just about their particular role that they're doing in the business, but it's holistic. It's a wider range, and the air express industry that we're in is different to a lot of other supply chains with like a traditional freight forwarder with more links in the chain, more agents and delivery companies and port agencies and the like. It's really just door to door. So it's one secure supply chain. That's good because it's fast and it's secure, but there's also risks in that if you get trusted insiders into that. So it's about recognising what part of industry, what industry you're in for a start, what are the strengths and what are the potential threats and weaknesses to that, and then attacking those and addressing them appropriately.
Now, conscious we've only got about 10 minutes left, so keep those questions coming in, and we'll get to them as they come up on the screen. I guess I'm interested, Hamish, just to project forward 6 months in your world. What does good look like? You know, what does the 17th of August look like? Where have we got to? How have those multiple entities moved in the way that they need to? What can happen that's going to?
Well, great question. I think the first thing is to start thinking and then document a risk management program by the 17th of August. But then the journey doesn't stop there. Actually, having a written plan that sits on a shelf is useless. Actually living it every day, constantly assessing it and using it to change a culture are some of the things that you can't measure outside of building a strong culture and seeing the change and feeling the change. I've mentioned before that you can often go into an infrastructure provider and you can feel the culture, and it's really hard to explain. And the worst examples are you can go into a infrastructure provider and you see the little poster with the password in the corner, and that's a striking image of saying, I wonder how security culture is here and how strongly people understand what the security risk is. Whereas you can go into a different area and say, oh, this is a key safe, here's the mechanisms we use, here's the governance structures, here are the different roles and responsibilities, and you can feel it. So the immediate challenge is have a risk management program, work with your boards and CEOs to start to work out how you do the annual attestation, which is due in 2024, but we encourage it to be done this year just to trial run it. And then I think the bigger thing is how by the 17th of August, if you change the culture, how do you think and how would you judge your cultural change, and how do you start to explain that to staff, to stakeholders, to suppliers, and to the management team?
So, I mean, one of the things I would add to it, and it's really a piece of advice more than anything, and an extension of what Hamish just said, establishing your risk management program does not equate to that you have effectively managed all your risks at a particular point in time. The bigger and more complex an organisation is, the longer it generally takes to shift the dial and start to put downward pressure on those risks. It takes time. You know, I've from my 20 years in the industry, I've watched some people be worried that by assessing and acknowledging that there are risks that are unacceptable, that somehow sharing that information means that it's somehow failing. That's not the case. That's a start point. Your risk action plan, which is encapsulated, or I would argue is part of your risk management program here, is turning around saying we acknowledge where we are now, and we're going to take incremental steps to be better than where we are now. And none of that will work, again, as we've touched on in a couple of the same things, without oversight of the top level, setting the culture from the board, making sure that management and supervisors actually draw it down, empowering people at the lower level. Because many of these initiatives will just take time to roll out. But what you will get at the back end of that is a more adaptive and a better responsive organisation to the shifts within the risk environment. Because I guarantee you, what I 100% guarantee, whatever the prevailing threat posture is at the moment within the national construct, within the national context, it will not be the same in 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years. And unless you've got some of this stuff in place, you will not be able to micro-adapt with that as the journey changes. There was a period we'll focus on one threat vector, and that morphed into another. We're now in the era where there's a significant focus on malicious and insider threat management, and also countering foreign interference. It will not be like this moving forward. It will be a different vector that will emerge. If you've got a strong risk management program, you'll be able to adapt to that.
I think that adaptive nature, if you're using an effective risk management process to deliver your security, it is adaptive. Yeah, it includes empowered people. There's a whole range of other things that go with it. But as Hamish was saying, you've got that effective governance, you've got that communication, you've got all those underpinning, those pillars, and it allows you to be agile and move with the changing threat. And that's, from a regulatory point of view, that's actually a struggle. But as I read the explanatory notes, I made the effort before I got here to read them. Thanks for sending them through. It was really interesting to see that there was a framework there that allowed that. Yeah, and one of the things, it's quite funny because my academic research is all about policy and why, in reality, why I think it often doesn't work. When I inherited ATT, I can't claim anything for the policy because people had already done the work, but we had a really neat piece of legislation that allowed us to adapt over time. And I see the same in the SOCI legislation. It will adapt over time. And I think, Ben, the focus of the program 4 years ago is different to the focus today, which will probably be different for 4 years. One of the lessons we've had to learn is how do you telegraph those changes to your stakeholder group? And I wouldn't say we've perfected that, but we've definitely become, we've been talking about it since I come in, the trusted insider. We're now talking about some different things. We moved that conversation, so there's always a conversation engagement. I really like your point about your outreach officers and the fact that you've got them there. I think that gives them a real smile, makes me feel really good about where the SOCI program's going, but that engagement becomes critical. I know we're tight for time, so I could probably talk about this for a while, so I'll let somebody else have that.
Well, why don't I issue 3 challenges for everyone on the call? And the first one is join the partner program for the Australian Cyber Security Centre. That'll give you a technical feed about things that might help you in a cyber perspective. Try and think about contributing to a trusted information sharing network working group and being part of the solution and attending those meetings and actually thinking at a sector level. And then finally, think about attending the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Conference on the 24th of March in Sydney at the ICC, and 500 people in the room, 10,000 online.
Wonderful. And in the last couple of minutes, some takeaways from you, or some calls to action to our audience.
Oh, from me, Matt. Sorry. Yes.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Yeah, look, one point that I don't think I've made, I think is critical to this, just for people's consideration, is that with all of these, rather than government just saying, manage your risk and fill out this form, do a risk assessment, period, it is important that the how and the why is delivered with that. So what are the risks? So rather than just, for instance, saying don't import commodity X because it's prohibited, if we can get information like, well, what pathway is it coming, what country is it coming, what time of year, build some more risk profile around, that's in a commodity example, but the same could be said for anything. That having that information and collating and compiling that it makes for a lot more of an efficient risk assessment for industry. So having that two-way flow, I know I've mentioned that ad nauseum, but it is just so critical. So just something to consider.
Right, Marty?
Well, I think we've done enough talking about the trusted insider, but understanding your business. And one of the things people say, you don't trust anyone. No, by having a good trusted insider program, you can trust people. You can share and you can empower more. So work out how you can empower your staff and how you can build that trust within a framework that is underpinned and you can have confidence in. Do that, and then again, if I could say one thing here, and Hamish may not like this, forgive me, Hamish. is risk isn't about a task force, it's not about a plan, it's about a dialogue. Now you need to detail that dialogue and have it in a format that you can show how it's generated the outcomes and the controls have been created. But if you don't have that dialogue, you will never have meaningful security risk management in place. So it's
the risk management program needs to be a written plan.
Absolutely, yeah, there needs to be a written outcome.
That's right.
One of the things we've seen again is people just want to cut and paste and give us the plan. If you can't articulate what it means and why it's important, don't waste your time.
Yeah, look, my key takeaway is investing in education and learning the fundamentals that underpin security risk and supply chain security, and inject it at every level of the organisation, from the executive down to the lower level. So know that the fundamentals, know the difference between a threat and a risk, between a vulnerability and an exploitable vulnerability. Know the difference between threat modus operandi and vulnerability mapping. These fundamentals, this knowledge is available with a little bit of research. Understanding what they mean and how to weave it into your risk assessment process will spit out a logical and structured risk management program, and that will put you on the right pathway to securing and creating a resilient supply chain and organisation.
Well, terrific. I think a wonderful discussion. I think to the point about the plan, Hamish, it feels like we're in the marshalling area. You know, the start line's August 17. We're marshalling, we're getting organised. We've got a whole host of challenges that the panel's set for everyone online today. So thank you very much for joining us. I think some great takeaways there. Clearly talking about culture and empowerment, making sure that you're collating, pulling that information together, developing a plan, but not leaving it on the shelf. It has to be agile. It has to be dynamic. You have to keep looking at it. And of course, that'll put you really in the box seat for that annual process that will commence in 2024.
So thank you everyone for joining us. Give a warm round of applause or a thumbs up for the panel. Ben, all the way from Sydney. Thank you, Ben. Hamish, thank you for giving us this wonderful space as well and hosting us today. Marty, as always, wonderful to have you. And Adash, thanks again for hosting.
And thank you as well to yourself, Matt, and the Cyber Collaboration Centre for putting your name on the banner and giving up your time to facilitate it.
No problems at all. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we need to